Dead Space was developed by Visceral Games, and it was published by Electronic Arts, EA. And this game, which originally came out in 2008, has become a cult classic, and it's widely known as one of the best horror games ever made, one of the best survival horror games ever made, and it's actually one of my personal favorite games that I've ever experienced. Easily within my top 20. The same goes with Dead Space 2, but for this video I'm just focusing on the first game. Now, when Dead Space originally came out, I had gotten the game as a Christmas gift that year, along with Mirror's Edge, and Gears of War 2 also came out that year. If I remember correctly, Star Wars The Force Unleashed also came out that year, as did the first Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm. And out of all the games that I played in 2008, Dead Space ended up becoming my favorite game that was released that year, for a variety of different reasons. And originally I had played this game on Xbox 360, and years later, along with Dead Space 2 and 3, I rebought the entire trilogy on PlayStation 3 through physical copies, and I played through the game again at least 4 times, 4 separate playthroughs, and I just recently replayed this game again for the first time on PC for this retrospective. After having spent some time away from the game, for a number of years, and coming back to it, there were some things that I had to get used to, such as the movement, by which felt kind of off and strange to me. If you go back and you play the original Dead Space, you can clearly tell that it's outdated, and not just in the realm of graphics. It's also outdated when it comes to, basic movement. There's varying mechanics that could use an improvement. And I know quite a few of these things were already addressed with the sequels to Dead Space, which play a lot more fluid and smooth compared to the first game. So I'm not really going to focus on superficial elements such as that. But just to ease into what some of the cons are for this game, because I came up with a solid list of 6 different issues that Dead Space has. And again, some of these things were improved with Dead Space 2 and 3. But one of the things that I found that really didn't work and that kind of frustrated me, not a great deal, but it was noticeable, is the weapon switching. The weapon switching mechanic is too slow. It suffers from a noticeable delay on screen. So when you're in the heat of combat and you need to quickly switch to a different weapon, it can be frustrating at times to try and switch to a different weapon, and the game takes its sweet time to switch to the weapon of your choice, which can lead to some cheap deaths. Another thing that really bothered me, and has always bothered me about the first Dead Space, actually, is the sound design. The sound design is too audacious, and it's extremely loud, basically for no reason. So when the necromorphs jump on screen, that's the enemies that they have in this game, that's what they're called, necromorphs. Whenever they pop up on screen, the music just starts blasting. If you're playing this through a TV screen, the sound can really become aggravating quickly. That's something I would like to see improved for the remake. I know it's a horror game, I understand it's a horror game, but that's no excuse to have the sound just blasting out of, whatever system that you're playing on, be it through a TV screen, a gaming monitor, or some kind of laptop panel. Another thing that really doesn't work with Dead Space, and I find this to be an issue with survival horror games in general, is the melee combat. Really, the only game that gets melee combat right is probably Resident Evil 4 and 5, because the melee combat in those games is tied to how accurate the player actually is when they're firing their weapon. Outside of Resident Evil 4 and 5, the melee combat in the other Resident Evil games is either non-existent or it's just terrible, like in what you have in Resident Evil 6. And in Dead Space, it's more similar to Resident Evil 6 with the melee combat, unfortunately. The only exception is that there's no stamina bar on screen. But the melee combat is so weak and ineffective that it's pretty much a waste. It's a waste of time. And if you're surrounded by enemies, or you find yourself in the unfortunate position to be low on ammunition, or you just simply don't have any ammo at all for any of your weapons that's in your inventory, the melee combat's really not going to help you progress past that point and basically get yourself unfucked. Not to mention the animation itself is extremely clunky and slow. Essentially, the melee combat is ineffective. And that's something they can work on for the remake, the Dead Space. And speaking of the weapons, there's a few weapons in the game that I do like a lot. The plasma cutter is arguably the best weapon in the game, and that's your starting default weapon. The plasma cutter, which is a fan favorite, is arguably the most popular weapon that's in the game. The best weapon objectively that's in this game is the force gun, and that's my personal favorite. The force gun is just a beast. It's basically this game's version of a shotgun, where if you're within a certain distance from your target, basically a few feet away or less, if you fire the force gun, what it does is it pushes the enemies back. It's basically the force push from Star Wars, just in munitions form. And it's extremely powerful. Even just the base version of the force gun that's not upgraded, like you haven't upgraded any of the damage nodes or anything, is easily powerful, and even some of the strongest enemies will die within just a few blasts. However, not all of the weapons in the game are good. The flamethrower in this game is extremely weak, and it's not really worth it to spend time upgrading that weapon. The same goes for the Ripper, which is my most hated weapon in this game, because what the Ripper does is that it releases a saw blade that basically extends itself a few feet away from where you're standing. And the problem with the Ripper is that it's extremely inaccurate. You spend more time fighting with the damn thing for the saw blade to actually land on your target than you actually do dealing any kind of significant damage. About the only use the Ripper provides is selling the ammunition, the Ripper blades, at the in-game merchant known as the store, where the player can go and purchase new weapons, purchase ammunition, purchase health packs, etc. So some of the weapons in this game are ineffective. Really, you can get through this entire game just using the plasma cutter, which is actually one of the trophies or achievements that was in the original release. And I should know because I got all the trophies for this game on PS3. I have played this entire game just using the plasma cutter, although it was upgraded, but that's besides the point. But if you do want a full arsenal at your disposal for any given situation, you at least want to have minimum the plasma cutter and the force gun. Beyond that, the pulse rifle and the line gun are also pretty effective. But for the remake, the Dead Space, I would like it if they actually made all the weapons effective. And that would be a significant improvement over the original game. Another problem that I've always had with this game are the powered versions of certain enemies, which are like the darker versions of certain enemies, which would include the baby-infested lurker and the standard humanoid necromorphs. And the powered versions of these enemies basically appear as a blackened or burnt version of the original enemy type. So whenever those enemies pop up on screen, they're extremely annoying to deal with because essentially they're just the same enemy, but they move faster for some reason, and they take a lot more damage by comparison. They are not fun to play against at all, and they end up wasting more of your ammunition than what should be possible or even necessary. This is another reason why I love the force gun so much, because the force gun, given that it's one of the strongest weapons in the game, it's also the weapon that has the cheapest ammunition type, at just 900 credits in the store for 3 rounds. So there seems to be a bit of an irregularity with how Visceral Games chose to disperse the ammunition in the store for the player to purchase. I'm not really sure what their intention was behind some of the prices in the store, but it's definitely something that doesn't really have an appropriate balance. Therefore, that's something that EA Motive can address for the remake. And the last issue I really have with Dead Space is how grindy the upgrade system is. The upgrade system in this game is it's a nightmare. Because essentially, you have all these different nodes that will give you, different upgrades. You have your damage increase nodes for all the different weapons that are in the game. You have added ammo capacity nodes for all the different weapons. And you also have faster reload nodes as well. So there seems to be a bit of a variety with the upgrades. The problem is that they're separated on these skill trees for each individual weapon. And there's quite a few nodes for each weapon where you don't gain any upgrades at all. Yet you actually have to find what's known as these power nodes. There's something that you have to randomly find throughout the game. And they're mainly used for upgrades, although there are certain rooms that are locked off by doors that can only be activated if you insert a power node. So you have to really choose, pick and choose what you're actually going to use them for and when. If I'm not mistaken, you can also sell the power nodes for a certain amount of credits, but I don't remember seeing that option in the store menu. Either way, I prefer the upgrade systems in the Resident Evil games by a long stretch. And that's because when you encounter an upgrade in the Resident Evil games, it's just automatic. It's basically scripted when you get certain upgrades in those games. And there's not a long upgrade tree, with the exception of Resident Evil 4 and 5. This game was clearly heavily influenced by Resident Evil 4, whose prominent and influential over-the-shoulder perspective takes a front seat as the primary perspective for this game's entire runtime. And this is what leads me into the pros. One of the best things about Dead Space, and the reason why the game is so effective, is that it nails a horror atmosphere. The silent halls of the USG Ishimura, which is the ship that you're on, that you're trying to escape, is very eerie and unsettling throughout this entire game's runtime. And the great thing about the atmosphere in Dead Space is that here and there you'll hear certain sounds and you don't really know where those sounds came from. Sometimes you'll hear enemies moving about because the necromorphs, they do traverse the ship in vents, the ventilation. And sometimes you'll hear something but not encounter an enemy, and you really don't know what's about to pop out at you unless you've played this game before and you instinctively know where everything is. And to emphasize the theme of space, which this game places its focus on throughout, here and there you'll hear the song, a more horror motif version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And this is also in a montage that's in the main menu if you just sit there and don't choose any options. The space setting flourishes due to emphasis on planet backdrops, zero-gravity puzzles, and mini-games, such as Zero-G Basketball, which appears, I believe, in Chapter 10, and asteroids, which you take control of a turret to shoot down in Chapter 4. The setting of space isn't just a gimmick in Dead Space. It's literally a part of the game's DNA, and it's what helps Dead Space carve out its identity that's unique from its primary influence, which again is Resident Evil. Another thing that works a great deal in Dead Space is the HUD. The HUD in the Dead Space games is one of the best that I've seen in any video game I've ever played. The HUD for certain video games can be overwhelming for the amount of space that it takes up on screen. Whereas in Dead Space, the HUD has been naturally inserted into the game via the actual character model. On the character of Isaac Clarke, the suit that he wears shows you everything you need to know. Your health bar is on Isaac's spine, as is your stasis meter. And when it comes to things like cutscenes in your inventory, those elements have been presented in this game in the form of holograms. If you want to pull up your inventory and shift some things around, or use a specific item, or you want to view an audio recording, or view an older cutscene that you've already experienced, you can press a button to initiate those things and they'll pop up on your screen as a blue hologram. And it's actually very creative and unique for any video game, for any genre. And that kind of thing really hasn't been replicated since Dead Space. And see, Visceral Games was smart, because not only does the health for Isaac appear on his character model, but the other characters that are in the game, the NPC characters, their health bars are also on their spine as well. So instead of just making it a simple gameplay mechanic, they actually inserted it into the lore of the world itself. And that was a very smart move. Dead Space forgoes the usual pre-rendered cutscenes, and instead presents cutscenes that are actually in-game. Now, this doesn't really work for every game that's out there, but in-game cutscenes aren't really new. But Dead Space uses the in-game cutscenes to great effect, mainly because they're kept short, and the presentation with the holograms makes them feel unique and special, because they're something Isaac himself actually has to pay attention to. And you can see this through his behavior and the animations that Visceral Games developed for the character. Similar to Resident Evil, Dead Space focuses its gameplay on targeting the limbs of the enemies. But whereas the Resident Evil games places an emphasis on going for headshots, or just simply shooting a target in the leg, Dead Space narrows its focus entirely on shooting limbs. And the game expects the player to engage with the combat system in this manner the entire time, from the beginning of the game to the end. And this is a gameplay loop that could have easily have gotten old. But thanks to some smooth and responsive mechanics and controls, the combat system is one of the things that makes Dead Space excel as a survival horror game, and as a shooter in general. Targeting the limbs of the necromorphs is a lot of fun. It's something that never gets old. And it is something that tests the player's ability to conserve ammunition. Much more so than the Resident Evil games, in fact. The enemies in the game are extremely varied. You have one that appears to be like a mix between a human and a scorpion. You have the lurker creature, which is basically an infected infant that's been turned into a necromorph and will fire projectiles at you through these tentacles, these 3 tentacles that sprout from its back. You have the larger brute necromorphs, which are heavily armored, but have weak points at the shoulders and the back from behind. And these are just some examples of all the different enemy types that they have in here. They even have a necromorph that appears to be a stingray, and it's their job to go around and infect dead bodies, which will turn corpses into new necromorphs. And that's basically how the necromorphs are born, how they multiply, and how they evolve. The necromorphs in the Dead Space games are some of the best examples of creative enemy design, clever enemy design that I've seen in the medium of video games. And while all the different types use the same methods against the player, the variety is clearly there. And they do provide a fun challenge every time they appear on screen. Another thing that helps Dead Space differentiate itself from Resident Evil are the suit upgrades, in which you can upgrade the suit that Isaac is wearing a few times throughout the course of the game, and you just simply find schematics, as they're called, to bring to the store so you can purchase whatever the upgrade is. Ammunition works this way as well. Like if you want to buy ammunition from the store, you have to find a schematic first, which the schematics are found throughout the game. They're scattered around the ship, and they appear in very controlled and scripted moments throughout the game. Another thing that helps differentiate Dead Space from Resident Evil is the stasis. You have a little blue meter that rests just next to your health bar on the back of Isaac's suit, and this represents your stasis meter, at which you can aim at an enemy and initiate stasis, fire some kind of stasis blast at them, which will slow them down. And this works on every enemy that's in the game. It's something that's very useful when you're in the heat of combat and you're surrounded by a group of enemies and you need to regroup or shift to a different location within the environment. Then you have zero gravity. The zero gravity sections that are in the game ask the player to solve simple puzzles in order to make progress in the story. And when you're in zero gravity, you can jump to really any point within the level and attach yourself to basically any surface. And to make those sections even more fun and creative, you have the necromorphs, which will also follow you, and they can also move in zero gravity as well, which is part of what makes them terrifying, because it essentially means that Isaac isn't safe anywhere on the ship, even with the confines of there being no gravity in space. And the necromorphs are pretty resilient in this game. Even when you're right next to one and your only option is to use melee combat, the necromorphs are capable of blocking, and they're also capable of initiating grapple attacks as well. But unlike Resident Evil, if you're grabbed by an enemy in Dead Space, you can actually fight back. Appearing as a QTE sequence where you have to tap a button repeatedly, rapidly, Isaac can free himself from any grapple attack before he's killed. And if the player succeeds in these QTEs, which are extremely easy to pull off, they can watch as Isaac takes glorious retribution against the enemy that he's trying to fend off. Between the suit upgrades, the stasis mechanic, the zero gravity moments, and the necromorph metamorphosis, Dead Space is something that clearly is inspired by Resident Evil, but simultaneously it's also not tied down by Resident Evil. And these things are what has helped Dead Space achieve its cult status within the gaming industry. The level design that's presented in Dead Space is a classic metroidvania style, with interconnected corridors and backtracking. And these are presented in the form of cohesive chapters. And there's 12 chapters total in this game. That adds up to a runtime of 8 hours. And this is great because it gives the player more breathing room. and encourages multiple playthroughs across several play sessions. And even after you finish the game for the first time, Visceral Games implemented a New Game Plus, which was handled very carefully and rewards the player with new gear and funds for their second playthrough. Once you finish Dead Space for the first time, you gain access to a new suit known as the military suit, and you get 50,000 credits along with new files that explains further the backstory of the USG Ishimura before the events of the game. The story in Dead Space is handled extremely well, and it cleverly avoids mundane tasks that are repetitive. So unlike Alien Isolation, which one of the biggest problems with that game was every time Ripley in that game was called to a certain part of the ship, you had to continuously do the same boring mini games over and over and over again. Dead Space avoids a similar issue by focusing more on its narrative. When he's called to a different part of the ship by his two surviving crew members from the start of the game, all three characters are always dealing with a new obstacle, be it certain necromorphs that are polluting the air that Isaac has to go take out before they destroy the ship's life support systems, or at the bridge at the front of the ship, which Isaac is called to so he can go and take out some asteroids as the ship is flying through an asteroid field, or when he's called to the back of the ship towards the engines so he can get the engines turned on, so the ship will be more operational compared to when they first found it. There's always something new that keeps the player guessing as to what's going to happen next. This is something that Alien Isolation failed to do, especially from a gameplay perspective. But Dead Space, by comparison, thrives on this, and does so in a much shorter runtime at 8 hours in length. So the game is short enough to where it doesn't overstay its welcome, but it's long enough to provide a satisfying gameplay experience, making it just the perfect length for a survival horror game. Beyond that, there are some small quips with the gameplay when it comes to engaging enemies that I really appreciate with Dead Space, such as the enemies actually being affected by stopping power, where they actually react when you shoot them. And this is an issue I've had with other survival horror games from the Resident Evil series, and even from games like Dead Space 3, which also suffer from this issue as well. And the upgrade system, while it's extremely grinding and time-consuming, it does give the player more reason to go back and revisit the game again and again for subsequent playthroughs. Despite some small gripes that I have with Dead Space, such as the kinesis mechanic being extremely limited in its use, and certain scripted moments that could have been handled better as far as enemy placement, this game remains one of the best horror games in the entire genre, and certainly one of the best survival horror games ever made. It was this game that really catapulted Visceral Games as one of the industry's most well-known and respected studios. And I'm extremely glad that EA has given Dead Space another chance and is now testing the waters with the IP to see what it can do with the upcoming Dead Space remake, which is being developed by EA Motive. I'm very curious to see what they're going to come up with, and there's definitely improvements that they can make over this, based on how they address some of the cons that I mentioned earlier in the video. But as it stands right now, Dead Space remains one of my favorite games of all time, and is a great example of how to tackle the genre of horror in the medium of video games. Now, I do have more 7th generation retrospectives planned. I have between 18 to 20 games that I would like to do. I probably won't be doing too many beyond that, if at all. But like I said, I do have at least around 20 that I would like to get to. So I'll be uploading these as my schedule allows me to.